From the illustrious floors of fired up motorcycles, we bring you this monster. Some of the older viewers might already be sitting forward in their seats because they know exactly what this is. If not, the gorgeous old school styling might be tickling your curiosity. It's a Kawasaki ZRX 1200R, a mighty 1200cc 4-cylinder based on a very special rider from a very special period in the 80s. But obviously, any bike that makes a stern effort at tributing a bike from the 80s might have some difficulties.
So here are the problems. First of all, it is carbureted. You remember those things? They used to be on like old bikes. Yeah, this thing has 4 of those carburetors, which means you don't get that throttle response of the fuel injector, especially the fly-by-wire throttles. So yeah, a little bit delayed. Also, it's 127 horsepower, which in today's terms, especially from a 1200 motor, it's a little bit pedestrian, let me put it that way, to just be diplomatic. Also, with all fuel and oil and everything, this bike weighs 242 kilograms, which implicitly means it handles about the same as the planet Jupiter. Now, that is all the things I would be saying if I were an ignoramus. But the thing is that I kind of know a bit of the history on, especially the 70s and early 80s. And this bike is based on a race bike of Eddie Lawson from 1981. In those days, it was all about motor. And, well, the frame was just a bit of metal that kind of hold the wheels on and stop the motor from dragging on the ground. It didn't matter. It didn't matter about turning. It didn't matter about stability. It didn't matter about stopping. None of that mattered. All that mattered was that the thing is damn fast. And that is why the people who rode bikes like that are heroes. And Kawasaki was probably the most insane, like they are now. Which means people like Eddie Lawson and those kind of guys, to me, are heroes. This is a 2007 model, but I have the imagination of a 6-year-old. So to me, right here, right now, I'm riding Eddie Lawson's bike, and it's big, and it's heavy, and it's everything. So the motor is not making 1,000,000 horsepower. It's not going to set you on fire. It's not going to break land speed records. But the way it feels, the sound it makes, especially with this exhaust on, and the way it sort of feels, the way it builds up power, it's got this sort of rough edge to it. Just feels special. It's got this special kind of manly quality to it. It does. It makes me feel like a man, real man, which is, you know, something I don't feel all that often. Also, now it is big and kind of bulky and sort of heavy. Now, normally that's terrible, but to me, right now, again, manliness. It's like, yeah, you got to work for it. You want to turn, boy? You want to turn? You better turn. Watch here. I'm going to come to this turn, and you better work for it. So, this is like the real men. Eddie Lawson and them. The real men used to ride. They were men. Yeah, you want this corner? You work for it. I really have the mind of a 6-year-old. It's brilliant. It's utterly brilliant. Motorcycles are not about getting you somewhere. It's about the joy of riding it. And bikes get different kinds of joy. This gives me 1981 real man kind of joy. Except it won't actually kill me, which is a good thing, you know, because I want to feel like a hero from 1981, but unlike them, I don't actually want to die. And that's what this bike does. And that's why it's terrific.
Don is, as usual, overcome with the emotion of his test bike, which is a good thing. Don't get me wrong, I am grateful that a man who has repetitive strain injuries and neck ache from constantly updating his social media and lives so deep in the digital world that he only knows how to make coffee at home, and this is true, by ordering it via an app to be delivered. I am grateful that he has learned to appreciate a bike that is so analogue. But I also don't think he's realised quite what an interesting model the ZRX or ZRX was when it was released. Because in a way it was, despite being a retro bike, actually quite a bit ahead of its time. Yeah, that sounds a bit convoluted. 2 points. First, even in the early 2000s, most bikers under the age of 30, say, would have had very little idea of who Eddie Lawson was, and they'd have just seen a funky naked bike with a different styling to, say, Suzuki's 1200 Bandit. And secondly, although the big expansion in biking these past few years has come from retro or neo-classic models, a naff term for new bikes styled to look like old bikes, this fashionable craze just wasn't a thing back in 1998 when the bike first arrived. So yes, it was a bike that celebrated the past, but it was just a bit too early to benefit from the coming explosion in demand for retro-themed bikes. Yamaha was experiencing much the same thing with its XJR 1300, which also first appeared in 1998. Period styling, great big, creamy, torquey four-cylinder motor and handling that was perfect for everyday riding and only started to feel a little bit out of its depth on a bumpy back road if you were getting a bit carried away with the pace. That's not to say these bikes couldn't actually be fun around a circuit, especially the lovely SP version of the XJR, or indeed the ZRX itself. Weaving and wobbling your way around the outside of a serious sport bike rider on an equally serious bike could be great fun. Sure, lap times weren't amazing, but the width of your grin after each track session was. And that's the point, isn't it? Really? The other two Japanese manufacturers, well, they eventually decided to join this retro party, but it was all too little too late. Honda was the last to arrive in 2010, I think it was, with the CB1100. It was, unsurprisingly, too sensible, too non-committal, not knowing how retro it actually wanted to be. It paid homage to the CBs of the past, not to one model in particular, and it was beautifully built, but it was pretty dull to ride. With only about 85 horsepower to get very nearly a quarter of a tonne moving, it was never going to be even remotely exciting, which is a shame. Other niggles included a mean little 14-litre tank on a massive bike and a general sense of a nice bike but missed opportunity. You wouldn't want to be stuck in a pub with someone who bought one of those Hondas instead of any of the other three Japanese alternatives. At least if the guy in the pub was on Suzuki's GSX 1400, you might be assured that at least he'd get a round in. This 2001 model harked back to the GS 1000 of the late 70s and it looked great. Massive, but great. Although to be fair, it did tip the scales a solid 20 kilos lighter than the Honda, so looks can be deceiving. The 1400 motor is the epitome of an under-stress gem. Like the Yamaha, it manages 105 horsepower with 20,000 Newton meters of torque, or so it feels. Smooth, and with one of those legendary Suzuki gearboxes of the time that was even smoother. You'd be a happy biker with one of these in the garage, especially if you plan on lots of two-up riding. All of which brings us back to the best of the bunch, which is the Kawasaki. When the ZRX first showed up in '98, it was an 1100 with an emasculated version of the ZZR 1100's engine. That's a good place to start, but too much sensibleness had creeped into the design, so only 96 of the ZZR's 150 horses were left. A decision that was corrected in 2001 with Don's ZRX 1200R that had 122 horsepower. It is a genuinely lovely bike. So good, in fact, that I would dare to suggest that most people, me included, would prefer to have this in the garage than Kawasaki's current retro offering, the Z900RS, which is undoubtedly also a very, very good bike, and quite obviously a far superior handling machine. Like I said, a retro bike that was ahead of its time, and if you ever get the chance to buy a good, clean example, do not hesitate. Because if you do, I'll have already nipped in and bought it from under you. Time for a break and some news when we return.